Hey guys, welcome back to the second video in my recap series of the Dubai Rapid Tournament. If you saw the first video, I won a pretty smooth game with the Mexican defense. In this game, we're going to see round two, where I played against a player by the name of Lakshman, rated 1462, and I had the white pieces. And I'll admit, before the game, I was a little bit conflicted what opening to play, just because there were so many chess fans coming up to me, making a lot of comments that they've enjoyed my London lectures. And because I've kind of developed this reputation of specializing in the London opening, I didn't really want to play the London, at least in this game. And I decided to play a different opening that I still have a lot of experience in, is the English opening. Not too many people know this, but this has been in my main tournament repertoire for the last many, many years. And I learned this when I was rated around like the low 2000s. And I've played this on and off for probably the last like 5 or 6 years. And one of the reasons to play the English, especially against a lower rate player, is a lot of people are prepared for e4 and d4 and may not have as much experience in English opening lines. My opponent played e5, so we're not transposing into any like queen's pawn, and basically we get what we can call a reverse Sicilian after knight c3, knight f6. It's basically like I'm playing a Sicilian but up a tempo. So there's some different nuances to be aware of. And here the main move is pawn g3, which we can see is most popular in the Lee Chess database. But in the Masters database, and the move that I like to play is knight f3. And this is a more confrontational move. I immediately attack the pawn, preventing black from playing the immediate d5. And one of the points of this move is it's trying to induce black to play e4, which would in some sense be a mistake, because after knight g5, the pawn is overextended, and in a variation like d5, cd5, bishop f5, there's going to be enough resources for white to win the pawn. And actually, I'm realizing right here that white can immediately take, and after all the trades, there's queen a4 in the end. So black has to be a bit careful in these lines. One thing I will say, and this is something that actually I saw earlier today, Anna Crowling was doing a stream with her dad, who's a well-known grandmaster. And there's a variation here, pawn b5, known as a Bellin Gambit. Her dad's name is actually is Bellin, so it's named after him. And it was a super cool lecture. I think she's planning to put the video on YouTube. But this is a tricky sideline, which if white's not prepared for, it can be very dangerous. I studied this a long time ago, and I would have known to play the basically the so-called refutation d3. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but it is fun sometimes to study these offbeats and sharp variations. So after knight f3, my opponent didn't play e4, played by far the most common move, knight c6. And here I played a move which has kind of been a pet line of mine over the many years. Actually, if we look in the database, the move I played is the fourth most popular move. More popular is g3, e3, e4, but my choice is pawn a3. And the reason why I like this move, especially against lesser experienced players, is it prevents the bishop from developing so actively. And there's a few potential traps here. Like if the bishop does develop to c5, white can start with e3. And the immediate threat is to play b4 and try and trap the bishop. So if black is really not careful, this could potentially happen. But I've had a decent number of games over the years, once in a tournament, probably a few times online, where my opponents play a5, and this allows for a center fork trick after knight takes e5, knight takes e5, and d4. And I'm actually curious here. I've had this position a few times on Lee Chess, And the one tournament game I had here, my opponent played bishop d6, and then c5 is very strong. And white already has a very significant advantage, engine approved. So black does have to be careful developing the bishop too early, and I prevented bishop to b4, so it's a bit of a question how black should complete development. And my opponent played one of the most natural moves, pawn d5. Now this move is a little bit risky to play because it's going into an open Sicilian down a tempo. And because I have the extra tempo, there's more room to play aggressively, which we're going to see very soon how the game unfolds and how black falls under major pressure. I will say the safer approach is to play g6. And this is a more kind of slow positional game. I would have played g3, bishop g7, bishop d2, castling, include d3, and play a structure like this, which is way more of a kind of standard English position. But in the game, my opponent played d5, and we got what we can kind of call a reverse Taimanov. I'm not sure if Lichess has a name for this. Calls it King's English variation for Knight's Korchnoi line. And the reason for playing queen c2, it's a very flexible move. In some cases, I want to target the knight in combination with pawn e3 and bishop e5, which we're going to see. And I also control this diagonal, which could be relevant in some cases. For example, there's a line bishop to e7, pawn e3, castling, and then after takes, really nice move, bishop d3. And in the Masters database, this has been played a good number of times. White trends not only bishop takes h7, but also bishop e4 in combination with b4, bishop b2. There's a lot of ways to pressure black center from very early on. So in the game, my opponent played very natural move, bishop e6. And one of the issues for black in this sort of position is natural moves tend to fall into trouble very quickly. Because after e3, bishop e7, I pounce with bishop to b5. And now we can see that black already has a lot of issues to deal with, mainly the fact that the pawn is undefended, and there's a lot of pressure against black's setup, and it's not entirely clear how to keep everything defended. A move like f6, which does defend the pawn, walks into d4, and white's just continuing to throw punches here. If pawn takes d4, the knight can take back, the bishop's hit, knight's hit, bishop d7 fails to knight d5. So we can see how things go downhill for black very quickly. So after bishop to b5, my opponent played bishop f6, which looks like a natural move. It's one attempt to try and keep things defended. But here I go for knight e4. And okay, this is where I'll hide the notation. Don't want to spoil the rest of the game. But knight e4, it's a nice multi-purpose move, not only unleashing the queen and mounting even more pressure against the pinned knight, but also having ideas of knight to c5. So in the event of queen d7, trying to keep everything defended, this just fails miserably to knight c5. Queen's attacked. If the queen moves back, there's some nice tactics here. Knight takes b7, queen takes, and it's a fork skewer of goodness, and white's winning a ton of material. So my opponent took a bit of a think after knight e4 and realized that there's not a great way to defend the knight. Although maybe it should have been, like a move like knight e7 should have been considered. But my opponent decided to castle, which I think in some sense is a decent practical decision, trying to treat this as a gambit and baiting me to take a pawn and hoping for some compensation. Now, I did go ahead. I took on c6, went up a pawn. And now it's really up to black to try and fight back in this position. So my opponent played rook e8, and I castled. And right after I castled, I realized that I missed my opponent's next move, which my opponent played relatively quickly is bishop to g4. And if I had seen this coming, maybe I would have played something different, like maybe h3 would be worth it. But the thing after bishop g4 is black wants to damage my kingside structure, and there's not a convenient way of defending the knight or moving the knight. So this is where I probably took my longest think of the game, just trying to figure out how to deal with this potential threat. And I came to the conclusion that I'd be okay with the transformation of the structure because there's not an easy way for black to exploit the king. And I decided to play pawn to b4. Now, I do want to address the move knight takes f6, which looks very natural. I think maybe a lot of people watching would play this move, but this only helps black because after knight takes, there's potential for pawn e4, and rook e6 is coming, and it's a little bit murkier in this position. So pawn b4, it's an attempt to complete development. I realize my bishop, it's my worst place piece. I wanted to turn it into something useful, and I did allow bishop takes f3, g takes f3, and now rook to e6. So there's still a little bit of concern given black has initiative. There's a potential of the rook lift, but after queen to c2, it still takes time for black to try and organize an attack. So my opponent played bishop h4, one of the only ways to make way for the rook. And here I play knight g3, a very safe move, covering the g file, unleashing the queen along the diagonal. Opponent pins a knight, and now I play queen e4, so centralizing the queen. Here I'm beginning to find some nice harmony with the pieces. The queen is very useful in e4, pressuring a lot of targets in black's position. My bishop is ready to develop, rook is ready to come in. On top of all of this, I'm up a pawn, and my king is very safe. And perhaps because of like all these reasons that the game is beginning to clearly go in my favor, my opponent made a terrible blunder here, played the move queen d7, completely missing that the bishop is now no longer defended. I happily scooped up the bishop. I'm sure my opponent would have loved to have a few extra moves to play this and this and this and this, but just not enough time. I took on h4. Rook h6 was played. I slide over, would be very happy with a queen trade. My opponent continued the downward spiral, played queen d6, and allowed a very feel-good fork on f5, hitting the queen, the rook, and threatening mate. So essentially a triple fork. And here's where black resigned. Now black could try and defend with a move like queen g6 or rook g6, but ever which way black tries, I'm going to be up a rook in the end and a pawn, so not much hope left. So knight f5 was a nice way of finishing up my second round game, and this gave me a 2 out of 2 start to the tournament. And if we reflect on this game, it was just a matter of getting an opening where my opponent was perhaps a bit less familiar, a bit less comfortable, didn't quite know how to deal with the early pressure, which can be very typical from the English opening. Sometimes English has a reputation of being more slow and maneuvering, but in a more open position like this, especially reverse open Sicilian, we can see that black does have to be very careful, and maybe it would be worth my opponent exploring some of the theoretical lines. A better option is to play bishop e7 and castle quickly before entering the trouble lines with the pin against the knight. So I was feeling pretty good. This set me up pretty well for round 3, which I will cover in the next video. So hope you guys enjoyed the game. As always, if you have questions, leave them below. I will be reading the comments. If you're enjoying the series so far, feel free to like and subscribe. It does help the channel grow. And I'll see you in the next video.